Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone in this room in BC campus and those who follow us on social media. In the framework of the colloquium Mimetic Theory and Political Theology, Ways to Overcome Polarization, we welcome today James Alison to reflect on the declaration Fiducia Supplicans on the pastoral meaning of blessings, issued by Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, Prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, on December 18th, 2023. The Roman Catholic Church has come a long and winding road for the recognition of the life of people in their sexual and gender diversity as members of the body of Christ. Called to holiness, all of us in the life of the Spirit, who welcomes us all to humanize and divinize us. James Alison has been a pioneer, along with other theological voices, not too much, just a few, in exploring this continent of human sexual diversity as a place of redemption. His theological reflection, rooted in the revelation of God's gift in Jesus as forgiven victim, reads between the lines like a melody in crescendo, the truth that set us free. Thank you, James, for your work for decades addressing this important matter for the body of Christ, and for accepting this invitation, being part of this colloquium. We will proceed as follows in the following 1 hour and a half. First, we will listen to your talk, around 50 minutes. And then we will move on a dialogue with the audience in this room. And if people following on Facebook Live would like to address some questions too, please feel free to put it in the chat. So the floor is yours, James Alison. Welcome.
Good afternoon. One of the things, let's say persons, who Carlos and I have in common was our much-loved novice master, Raul Vera. We both had the same novice master in different years, the same novice master. And one of the features of our novice master, apart from his holiness, goodness, and many other heroic virtues, was an inability to speak for short lengths of time. In fact, he was extremely long-winded. So one of our gifts as novices was trying to find ways of cutting him off when he threatened to preach for 50 minutes on a weekday, etc., etc. So Carlos, one of the things, of course, as we grow up, is that we then become parodies of our novice master. So I would ask you to exercise the novice role of cutting me off if I threaten to become too like Raul. In the time allotted. So the title which Carlos and I came up with was after Fiducia Supplicans, the status of witness and the Ecclesial Endgame. And of course, that's going to require me to go back somewhat before Fiducia Supplicans in order to give an arc of narrative within which I think we find ourselves. So that's what I'm going to do, if that's acceptable for you. And I'm going to take this arc, just in my own experience, way back. In the early 90s, I remember having a discussion with a distinguished Scottish Dominican philosopher theologian, of whom some of you may have heard or some of you may have read, called Fergus Carr, author, amongst others, of Theology after Wittgenstein, numerous Thomistic works. And I raised the question, how is change going to happen in this area? Is it going to be possible in the Catholic Church to change in matters of what we now say LGBT? And he said, "Oh, I don't see how the Church can change in this area. I mean, it's got no mechanism." And that struck me as a very interesting remark, that there's no mechanism which would allow change, no already interior Catholic mechanism for change in this area. And from that time onwards, I thought, okay, he's right. There is no mechanism in the way in which we normally understand mechanism. Therefore, if this is something of the Holy Spirit, the question is going to be, how is the Holy Spirit going to make change possible within the life of the church, which is supposed to be some sort of sacramental sign of the life of the Spirit, some sort of Catholicity, including us all. And ever since then, I've concentrated on a particular freeze frame moment in the scriptures, which is the freeze frame moment in Acts 10. You remember what's happened in Acts 10. Cornelius the centurion has received a visit from an angel. The angel has told him to send for one Simon Peter, who's staying in the house of a tanner in Joppa, and ask him to come and talk to you. So he does. Meanwhile, Simon Peter is having a vision on the roof of the Simon the tanner's house, from which he seems to learn something. He seems to learn something, especially when, after his vision, his reverie, a voice cries out, which is the crying out of the arriving messengers. But in Greek, it's exactly the same verb as the crying of the cock at the moment he had betrayed Jesus previously. And it happens after he's 3 times rejected an instruction to sacrifice and eat apparently impure things. Do you remember this motion? So anyhow, he's clearly perplexed as to what's going on, but he accepts the invitation, goes down and enters the Gentile house, because on the way it's worked out that God has told me not to call any human impure or unclean. And then he finds himself giving a lecture about Jesus to his stump speech, if you like, about Jesus to the gathered Gentiles, in whose house he now finds himself, despite saying, as you know, people like me are not allowed in houses like yours because of the purity rules. And then when he finishes, or before he finishes speaking, the Holy Spirit falls on them. And Peter and his mates who come with him from Jerusalem are astonished to see that the Spirit has fallen on them just as it did on us. In other words, they are like us. And so he says, who can withhold water to baptize them, and orders them to be baptized. So there we have the first Gentile baptism. And what I think as LGBT is in the freeze frame between the Holy Spirit coming down and Peter recognizing they are like us, if you'll excuse the language. And so what I take that I have been trying to live over the last decades, as you say, Carlos, is attempting to work out what the shift during that freeze frame is as a working of the Holy Spirit in our lifetime. So if I may set that as the background to what I'd like to share with you, and I hope you find it a suitable background. But in order to get to Fiducia Supplicans, which I say came to me at least as a great surprise, but I know forewarning of it. I don't think I could have had a forewarning of it in the sense in which it actually emerged. I heard that there were some rumors about another Roman document on blessings, to which I thought, oh, good Lord, spare us. Because fearing the worst, as usual. But something did change there. I want to take time to get that, because I think it's rather important do we get something of the drama of what did in fact change. Let's go back to, and I think it's important to discuss this, particularly for many of you who've been discussing decolonial issues, and of course the impact of our church's life in different cultures and different continents. I'd like to take this back to the anthropological shift which we have been undergoing, particularly as Westerners, which means both in our homelands and during our colonial periods. I'm thinking particularly of the English and Spanish imperial ventures and the way they affected the Western world to a lesser extent, the French. For the very curious reason that the French colonial enterprise, apparently there was never any over against the queer as part of French identity. Whereas both in the case of the English imperial colonial venture, it happened after the Reformation, when the Catholic, papistical, Jesuitical, sodomitical other was the enemy. So part of the civilizing Protestant mission of the English colonial empire was getting rid of that sort of thing, which, of course, as you know, has consequences on the penal codes of half the world. Only recently lifted in India, and it was the same number of the penal code as it is in all the other countries, because it was the British penal code from the 19th century. The Spanish colonial adventure dealing with this, the queer other was the Moor, the Moro, from whom who had been expelled from Spain, well, they hadn't yet been expelled, but from whom Spain had been reconquered by a new form of Christian knighthood. And so the idea, the positive self-image of Spanish Christian knights was not putting up with that sort of thing, because that was the kind of thing that Moors did. Just to give you an idea how our home enemies have such a big impact on the colonial British. Anyhow, there are plenty of history books that show how that. But the real difference for us, and it's important to understand, it began in the 17th century, I would say, with the invention of companionate marriage. Many of us historians know all about this, but it was a significant rupture in what I think is now technically called a homosocial society. Homosocial meaning, from a very young age, infants of both sexes play together, but from a very young age, girls are separated and grow up amongst women, and boys are separated and grow up amongst men. And socialization thereafter is strongly controlled and invigilated. Marriage happens young and is organized, at least young for the women, not necessarily for the men. It's organized and depends very much on kin, family, property, security. In other words, the subjective interest of the couple is secondary. If they then fall in love, which does happen, arranged marriages can lead to very loving marriages. If they fall in love, that's great. But if they don't, well, they're doing their duty by keeping the family thing going. But in the homosocial world, what happens outside the official structure is invisible. There is a huge don't ask, don't tell. And nowadays it's people who visit Islamic countries, who, particularly hardline Islamic countries, who are aware of how this homosocial world works, because we see the very strict divisions. And there are, therefore, a huge don't ask, don't tell surrounding what women do in their world and what men do in their world, provided it's not talked about. Which, of course, has now been collapsed, and gradually collapsing, even in those worlds, by the introduction of modern Western terms like gay, which have had a shocking effect, of course, within homosocial worlds, leading President Ahmadinejad, as you remember, to say in public, there are no gay people in Iran, which, of course, produced laughter when he said it. But in one sense, he was making the point, Iran, there are no heterosexual people in Iran either. It's a homosocial society in which, of course, there are no people who are one thing or the other. There are people who may do things. But what people are is a structure of reproduction of the family system, etc. Now, in the 17th century, our invention of companionate marriage marks a significant difference to that world. Because if it starts to become the norm that your spouse is a person with whom you want to be best friends for life, in other words, it's someone you choose as your equal out of affection rather than for any particular reasons of kinship, family, property, etc., etc. Well, that alters the whole way of understanding how courtship, kinship, sex, family, and life work. And one of the effects of that, and this is detectable by historians during the 17th century, is that for the first time, what we would now call gay life becomes visible. Because, of course, in a don't ask, don't tell world, it's invisible, and it's deliberately invisible. It's, we do not ask about these things. They go on, yes, provided there's no huge scandal, we don't want to know. From the 17th century on, it became visible that there were people who didn't know how to play the new game of heterosexuality. Because, again, in sociological terms, what was invented was heterosexuality. The notion that what we are basically is people who have sexual orientations for other people, and this will probably lead to marriage with somebody of the other sex. Sociologically, that was a novelty. As, if you like, it becomes clear, which hadn't been clear before, that there were some people who just didn't know how to play this game, how to play a different game. Their pubs, their cruising grounds became available, and they became available immediately as a focus of two things. One, police presence, whatever the forms of police there were at the time. The king's men took cognizance of this, because if there were these weirdos having strange gatherings, might they not also be traitors, treasonous? And of course, that was indeed one of the associations created, at least in the English mind, between papists, Jesuits, traitors, sodomites. Numerous burnings in the 17th century attest, the 16th and 17th century attest to this, as you probably know, as what's the word? Delighted students of a Jesuit institution. The anti-Jesuit conspiracy theory of the British regime was one of the first great conspiracy theories of history. But that's important, just historical knowledge and family of this. So you get police presence, and then accompanying that, blackmail, with the result that this new reality became constantly a matter of police presence and blackmail. Therefore, it was treated as something suspicious. Who are these people? What do they do? Why are they not like us? What's wrong with them? In other words, the first approach to these people was under the magnifying glass of the fake, for obvious reasons. The question is, what's wrong with these people and what do we do about it? Question of control, expulsion, often enough murder, often enough execution. Now, over time, into the 18th and 19th century, you get a shift from understanding it as a question of treason and a political crime. As the regimes become more solid, they recognize that it's going to take more than a few queers to disrupt their political structure. And it becomes a medical issue. As medicine becomes the new field, people start thinking, what's the medical problem? Then they can't really find anything medically different, at least at the time, between these weird, and of course, the first visible was amongst gay men, much more visible women in this area. And then in the 19th century, it became a question of mental health. And when that became the new issue, we put them in Bedlam, put them in asylums to control it that way. There must be something wrong. Until eventually, and this is one of the things that would be shown Foucault with a slightly different background to the issue brought out, there was a breakthrough moment in 1869, when a Hungaro-Russian researcher called Kertbeny invented the word homosexual. As part of a polemic with the Prussian sodomy laws, which were being revisited at the time, to say, listen, these people, they may do all things, but it's just because they're like that. It's not because they represented a particular danger. The notion that there just were people who were this way. And for that, he invented the word homosexual. It had clinical overtones, but it was literally the first time that rather than the acts being the issue as part of a how do we control this, it became a sort of person. And that was at least the first attempt at a sort of person, or as I said, of a clinical sort. Well, between the end of between then, start getting the development of modern psychology, you get Freud, who, along with his early colleagues, assumed that there must be some pathology at the basis of this way of being, but that it was something that people were was not in question. There must be some pathology. Early Freud, for instance, assumed that paranoia was at the root of being homosexual. And since then, one perhaps thinks that if you were a gay man in Vienna in 1890s, maybe you had a reason to be paranoid. After all, distinguished Austro-Hungarian officers were invited to suicide by the royal troops when it discovered that they were this way. There are famous historical cases. What you then start getting at the beginning of the 20th century is people studying what appear to be significant masses of people gathered together. This starts in Germany. The earliest studies in this area come from Germany and were given a huge boost by the First World War. For the obvious reasons. In fact, this is one of the bizarre features of the modern LGBT experience, was that the knowledge of who we are is almost directly related to the two world wars. Why? What happened in the First World War? Mass mobilization. Huge numbers of young men sent to the army, huge numbers of young women sent to armament factories all over Europe and North America. Which meant that for the first time, people from the endless equivalents of Peoria, the worldwide equivalents of Peoria, suddenly discovered that they were not the only gay in the village, if you excuse the language, that there were other people like them. And that thereafter, at the end of the mass mobilization, in which they had discovered many others like themselves, they returned, rather than going back to Peoria, they went to New York or London or Berlin or wherever there seemed to be others like them. And that's really where you start to get the first studies of people who are beginning to ask what one might say the scientific questions. What makes these people tick? And of course, the very first scientists of this sort in Germany in the 1920s wrote books on the subject. And then in 1932, 1933, there was a certain regime change. And one of the first things that the regime did was burn all the books and either kill or exile the people who'd been studying this matter. And as you probably know, it was quite important for the early Nazi party to distance itself from any suspicion that it was gay, because the head of the SA, Karl Röhm, was very gay and had lots of pretty boyfriends, and was personally a very close and affectionate friend of the Führer. So it became enormously important to distance the Führer from all that sort of thing. So the Long Night, the Night of the Long Nights, but Visconti film about it, Boris State. So that period of learning came to an end, and many of the works were destroyed and lost. It happened again after the Second World War, when, of course, thank heavens, a vastly greater proportion of those under arms survived than in the First World War. But again, the return to Los Angeles, to San Francisco, to New York, to London, to Paris, to wherever, of people who had discovered other people like themselves was repeated. And you got a significant mass who, in this case, were able to be looked at by American shrinks of the epoch. And the most famous one for our purpose was called Evelyn Hooker. I don't know whether that name rings a bell. Dr. Evelyn Hooker, rather wonderfully named, given the circumstances. And she conducted a test. At the behest, she was challenged to conduct a test by her gay friends in Los Angeles at the time, which is, all the shrinks say they know what's wrong with us. They say that there's something wrong with us. There is some pathology which is intrinsic to our way of being. We can't see it. Can you devise a test that will see whether it's true or not? And she did. She came up with a test that put the profiles of 60 males using the full psychological profile proper at the time. She put that down, removing only the sexual orientation of each of the males in question. And then she challenged the shrinky establishment to say which of these is gay, which is straight. You all say you know what makes gay people gay, what strange mixture of Freudianism and some post-Freudianism leads you to think that these people. And of course, we say now, of course, none of them was able to come even close to distinguishing which one was in fact gay or straight. And we began to see for the first time, if you like, the scientific evidence that we're all as screwed as each other. If you like, that sexual orientation is not a pathology. There is no pathology that is intrinsic to a same-sex orientation. There are minority stress factors, as with any minority, that can affect people who are in any minority situation. But that's different from something that is intrinsic to people of a same-sex orientation. And that has stood up over time. And it's from then on, if you like, that you start to get what I take to be the scientific model, which is rather than, I wonder what's wrong with these people, it's, I wonder what makes these people tick, which is only possible after you stop trying to scapegoat them. While the lens is a scapegoat, it's pre-scientific. It's only once you stop thinking this is a problem that I must solve that you're able to start asking the genuinely interesting questions. What is it? Why does it happen? How does it happen? Which has been, of course, being studied since then. Now, as you know, that was known, incidentally, by the medical profession pretty thoroughly by the mid-1950s. You can tell how thoroughly because when the British Parliament asked a scientific committee to determine whether or not it should decriminalise, the medical results were completely clear already that there is no pathology intrinsic to this way of being, and therefore there's no particular need to criminalise. In fact, the only effect of criminal law was to enrich blackmailers. That was they said that it was known as the Blackmailers Charter. The law at the time it was abolished. So, a significant piece of human learning occurred over a 400-year period, owing to the collapse of the certain scapegoating lens. That's what I like to say. What people individually and privately may have known or suspected that there was nothing wrong with being this sort of person became something of public evidence over time. And I think that that is what we would call a scientific fact in quite a modern and sophisticated way of understanding what a scientific fact might be. Now, ever since then, that's been the presumption, that's the direction that we've been moving in. We've applied the same thing, it's obviously understood with relation to women, in relation to gay women who were not immediately as visible as the gay men, not least because in the British legislation, famously Queen Victoria refused to admit that there was such a thing. So it came, when presented with the law to try and criminalise it, she said, "What is this?" And they explained to her. She said, "That's impossible. I'm not going to sign this." So she refused to sign it. So there was no law in the British Empire forbidding lesbians. Bizarre, but true. Wonderful what a prude can do sometimes. But also, obviously, it's affected the way that now we look at the wider issues of gender identity. The whole notion of this is a question that must be looked at inductively rather than through the scapegoating lens. Difficult though that be for some to achieve. Now, why is this interesting or a problem? Well, because effectively it's led to the situation where we are now, which is where what we know to be true about a significant group of people is a piece of culturally sensitive learning that happened in a particular culture at a particular time through a particular history. But B also says something true about people living in cultures and societies where the same historical process has not happened, but where people are beginning to identify with the terms that have been given them by this particular process, which leads to some resentment of this being a colonialist export, even though in many cases the original colonialist export was virulent homophobia of a religious sort. But I hope you see the importance of realizing that this is a piece of cultural learning on our part, leading to difficulties with cultural change in other parts. So that's an important consideration. The second consideration, of course, is that this leads us into a frontal collision with the teaching of the Catholic Church. Why? Well, I'll just go again, if you excuse me, going back to the beginnings. I'm going to try and avoid my novice master. I'll try to keep it going as fast as I can, because we've got a long way to go. As you know, the basic code of Christian teaching in terms of marriage and sex, there's literally only one teaching, which is that the marital relationship between spouses open to procreation is good. And everything else is bad. Everything else is a negative deduction from that. Quite literally. You don't need to go very far into church teaching to see that such a thing is described as intrinsically disordered or lacking its indispensable finality. What it means, whether it's talking about homosexuality or about contraception, is that the one thing that is open, the one thing that is good is the marital act open to procreation. Why? Well, from the time of Clement of Alexandria, this was the best understanding, that the logos of the time, the best teaching and into learning with nascent Christianity gave them to understand God's created will in the world. God's created will is clearly shown in the possibility of human reproduction. Nevertheless, sexual pleasure seems to have something demonic about it, because it seems to be linked to Eros and Aphrodite, and these are Greek gods and therefore possible demons. Therefore, there appears to be an inherent relationship between the sexual act and the act of procreation. Therefore, that is good, but it must be done without pleasure. Indeed, as you probably know, Clement of Alexandria said that if a husband gave his wife pleasure, then he was turning her into a whore or an adulteress. Just so you know where what fun heterosexuality is. For those of you who don't know about heterosexuality, it's good that you learn this. But that's been, you understand, that's been the core teaching up until Humanity. Quite literally. It's altered over time because, as it were, from the 17th century onwards, and the notion of marriage being a friendly, loving relationship, the notion, therefore, of there being a unitive function to sex, in other words, lovemaking for the pleasure of making love and of companionship, started to acquire also a realistic heft of its own. So that was fairly late in the game. Remember, it only really hit Catholic theology in the late 19th, early 20th centuries as something that began to be considered as a possible end of the sexual act. But remember, the sixth was, yes, okay, we'll allow that in so long as it's never severed from the procreative end, which is the real end. There's this kind of secondary end. And of course, that became fatally wounded by the invention of the pill and other more effective and hygienic methods of contraception, which is what, by the middle of the 20th century, led to the crisis around Humanae Vitae. And what is the crisis around Humanae Vitae? Is Paul VI going to hold the teaching that was the uninterrupted teaching of the Church from Clement of Alexandria onwards, which is that the only good form of sexual act is one that is open to procreation? And the answer is yes. That's eventually what he did. Now, from the point of view of our discussion, what is interesting, and this is particularly interesting in a Jesuit context, is that while he was mulling on how he was going to deal with the issue of the fact that the commission which he'd set up to look at this question recommended by a vast majority that he shift this teaching. A French Jesuit, a very distinguished French Jesuit called Gustave Martelet, visited him and said, Holy Father, if you drop the link between the procreative and the unitive function of sex, you will be depriving the church of any logical reason to teach against homosexuality. I just want to say that because A, what he says is true, and B, it indicates with absolute clarity what the church's teaching on homosexuality is. It's an a prioristic deduction from the goodness of the marital act open to procreation. It was always a teaching about acts based as a negative deduction from the teaching about the goodness of the act open to procreation. As I made clear in my little historical entry, the notion that there was a certain sort of being with a certain sort of condition called homosexuality, a way of being, didn't occur to anybody until the late 19th century. So the teaching had never referred to the way of being. It had always been a negative deduction about that. Okay. Now, in 1975, so following Humanae Vitae and the keeping of the link between the unitive and the procreative function, as you know, a teaching immediately ignored by 95% of Catholic straight people, a very significant proportion, anyhow. For the first time ever in 1975, the Vatican feels the need to talk about homosexuality. And the very first time the word appears in any teaching document of the Church is in 1975. So when people talk about there being an uninterrupted teaching about homosexuality, they mean, goodness gracious, yes, all the way back to 1975. Quite literally, since the word itself was a 19th century thing, and all the previous teaching had been about acts. So the document deals with this by repeating, in the wake of Humanae Vitae, the document is about several issues to do with sexuality, not only to do with homosexuality, but it repeats the position that gay, same-sex sexual acts are intrinsically evil. What does it mean by that? It means however much you do them, they're never going to have the right outcome. In other words, there's no circumstance in which they will do what they're meant to do. Something which is pretty obvious to most of us who are gay or lesbian, but obviously the church authorities need to remind you. Gay sex doesn't lead to babies. But that's literally what that means. Intrinsically is not, as many people hear it, unfortunately, a kind of a stress, as though it's saying it's especially bad, or it's particularly wicked. It's merely saying, however much you do it, it's never going to do the right thing. And that's quite literally what. But they also said, this was the first time, they said some people are beginning to say that the homosexual condition is itself something neutral or even positive. And this must be severely rejected by an excuse for people to practice. Okay, they haven't yet circled the wagon of their own teaching. They're still trying to hold on to a teaching about acts, but they're aware that the moment you start saying, well, people just are this way, then what's wrong with the acts? So they have to say, no, you can't treat the being as something neutral or positive. But I haven't yet closed the circle. They do that finally in 1986 in a terrible document, which came out with, as you know, the following phrase: while the homosexual tendency is not in itself a sin, it is nevertheless a tendency to more or less strong acts which are intrinsically evil, and therefore the tendency, must be considered objectively disordered. What do they mean by objectively disordered? Well, not ordered towards its object. What is its object? A sexual relationship with someone of the opposite sex capable of having a baby. But so what they're effectively doing is that they are demanding that gay and lesbian people deduce who we are negatively from the marital act, and not from what we have discovered to be true scientifically over the last 400 years. You see the problem which that sets up. It is effectively saying, do not be fooled into thinking that you are really gay or lesbian. What you really are is someone who is intrinsically heterosexual, but who suffers from a very grave form of distorted desire, which then some Charlie decided to call same-sex attraction as a way of making it seem lighter than same-sex orientation. And of course, that laid the ground for conversion therapy and the various people who basically, that's at the very, literally at the very basis of Dr. Nicolosi, who's one of the first conversion therapists teaching, which is, you are not gay or lesbian, you are an intrinsically heterosexual person who suffers from a grave disorder of desire. Therefore, you must pray away the gay. I hope you can see the logic behind this. Now, it obviously ran aground of what we know to be true. And of course, that's becoming increasingly obvious over the last 50 years. Difficulty with the church, please excuse again this, was that for the last 50, 60, 70 years, this has put a crisis in church structure. For the obvious reason, up until, let us say, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the only safe place to be if you were a gay or lesbian person in a quite unsafe civil environment was the church. Whether in a convent amongst females or a seminary amongst males, it was the one place where no one demanded to know who your girlfriend or boyfriend was. No one te cobró novio, as they say in Spanish. Which meant that there was a relatively benign don't ask, don't tell in the ecclesiastical world, as opposed to the really rather tough don't ask, don't tell outside. You can think of, I think of many clergy of the generation of Paul VI, people, let's say, who grew up in the 1890s. Let's say 1913, you become 13 or 14. You begin to become aware that you don't desire quite like others. What you see around you, a dangerous, difficult place with lots of blackmail, murder, syphilis everywhere, apart from anything else, and complete loss of reputation and not being like that. And you want to be pious, and you want to be good, and how you're not particularly fascinated by being someone like Gilles or some of the early French writers in this hanging around the pissoir of Paris for a quick jerk off. You go to a seminary. And not being that sort of person becomes part of your identity. But it's beginning to become part of your identity at a time when there is beginning for the first time in literature to begin to be explored in both the male and the female writings of the time what it means to be this sort of person. In other words, a subjectivity is emerging, which you are now beginning to have to form yourself against. And actually, one of the really interesting things about Frédéric Martel's book on the closet, Power and Hypocrisy in the Vatican, is his discussion of Jacques Maritain, the closeted gay man, and his attempt to try and keep his other French gay, authorial, artistic friends in the closet, because he could understand the effect of the subjectivity that was going to break out. And of course, since Martel's book, more of Maritain's correspondence has become available, putting to rest any doubt about this. This was clearly something tremendously important to him. And Maritain's teaching was important for the formation of the whole Paul VI generation. What did we have during the rest of the 20th century? We had a period in which civil society becomes ever more tolerant, and eventually decriminalizes and so forth. And because of that, what had been a relatively benign don't ask, don't tell charity becomes ever more hardline. What used to be a relatively benign don't ask now becomes an enforced don't ask, don't tell, which of course immediately starts having strong consequences on the possibility of people living honest lives as priest and clergy in a way that they had been no more or less dishonest than the rest of society before. And of course, that's what we've been surviving since then. Now, we've reached the stage when, thank heavens, the generation, if they were alive now, they would be in their mid-90s, where they are passing to glory. But if we think of again, Frederick pointed this out, the cardinals surrounding John Paul II were all gay men with double lives. All. The only one, as far as we know, who didn't have a double life was Pope Benedict. Literally, Sodano, Lopistri, all of these advisors. Famously, John Paul was not a man of distinction of character, judgment about character, given how his famous treatment of Maciel, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ. But that generation, some virulently homophobic, some not homophobic, some genuinely gentle, just trying to live peacefully, but all of that sort, which is an astounding testimony, if you like, to the cognitive dissonance that was gradually built up within church life during the second half of the 20th century, as it became necessary to clamp down and to be against something in order to survive within the ecclesiastical system. Thank heavens that has started to break down with Pope Francis. One of the reasons why is because he was obviously himself aware of this mechanism from his time as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, when the principal people who attacked him were virulently closeted cardinals in Rome, Sodano and Lopez Trujillo, with a bishop who's still alive, so I won't mention his name, in Argentina, who was the absolute classic, a figure recognizable to you all, extremely homophobic, but somehow curiously Grand Duchess-like figure who mysteriously seemed to be constantly surrounded by beautiful young men. Basically the ecclesiastical caricature, the caricature ecclesiastical closet. But these were the principal enemies. And Francis seems to have understood that where you get extreme homophobia, it's not exactly a sign of advanced heterosexuality. And he's determined to stand up against it. The term that he used, at least at the beginning of his pontificate, was rigid, attacking the frigid. He said, well, wherever you find rigidity, you will always find that there is something else going on in the background. But more recently, and I was stunned by this, when asked by a young person on a recent Disney Plus interview he had with young people, one of them asked him about this, and he said, when asked why bishops and priests are so often so hostile to gay people, why they won't receive them, he said, oh, son infiltrados. He talks about people who are infiltrators, who use the teaching of the church to hide their own private passions. And I thought, whoa, I've known that ever since I lived in the ecclesiastical sphere. I'm sure most people know that, because most people who live in the ecclesiastical sphere are aware that the heresy hunter, the queer hunter in any seminary or convent or a religious community is someone who is not exactly shining by their heterosexuality. It's very rare to get a straight person who's seriously worked out about gay people in their midst. So I've always understood that, but to have the Pope actually saying so seemed to me to be quite extraordinary. So he's aware that this is part of the key to the problem of clericalism. And I think that that explains a good deal of what has been going on in the building up to Fiducia Supplicans. One of the things that he's understood from early on is that attempting to deal with this issue straight on honestly doesn't work, because the violence, the virulence of the arguments produced are out of control. It's not possible to have rational conversation with people for whom this is a sacred allergy. Apparently there was an attempt to talk about it. The very first synod that he had, the 2014 synod, was that the first of the two on the family. Or was it on young people? I forget which one it was. But there was a mild attempt to introduce discussion about this, which apparently led to some incredibly violent speeches on the floor. And I think that he realized, whoa, this is going to have to be dealt with a different way. And I think that his way of dealing with it is basically to say, okay, I understand relationality is always prior to rationality. The real is prior to the idea, it's bigger than the idea. Time is bigger than space. The notion that it's only horizontally as relationships change that it's going to become possible to rethink this. I think that a good deal of his insistence on a horizontal process of synodality rather than a pyramidical process is precisely so as to encourage a mutual education process in this, amongst other matters, going forward. This is obviously related to the many features in which the clerical system has been unable to learn anything, not anything from or about women. But it's part of the same process. Only by setting up horizontal mechanism of learning that this thing becomes possible. So we reach the point which we had reached by this recent synod, which was, I thought, interesting enough to have given us much material to discuss for the foreseeable, at least for the rest of this year until the second part of the synod. Because there, despite all the lamentations that said that they wouldn't really be able to talk about anything LGBT specifically, they did something much more important than specifically name the issues. They said, and this is in paragraph 15, little letters G and K, for those of you who want to look at the synod's final document, that on the issues of gender orientation and so of gender identity and sexual orientation, and in the Italian it used those terms. The English was badly translated and said gender and sexuality, but the Italian original said gender identity and sexual orientation, much clearer what they were talking about. He said these issues obviously need to be studied in such a way as to bring to bear all the understanding of modern science and psychology. In other words, finally allowing the inductive method in the study of these issues, which of course Vatican II had recommended as a general issue for moral discussion, but which since then the CDF and Pope VI had kept back from applying in matters of sex and marriage. And here was the Synod effectively giving the Pope permission, if that's what he wanted to do, to open up, to tell the CDF, please open up to an inductive method in dealing with these issues. And then it said, there's a little paragraph K, in order for this to happen, we must have, meaning the Synod must have organized meetings in which people can talk about this with riservatezza and schietezza. So riservatezza with confidential circumstances, so confidential meetings, and schietezza, which means frankness. Though again, in the English translation, it came out as something else, suggesting at last that it now must be, and specifically saying that there must be first-person people involved, must be done with the people who are themselves affected by this discussion. And that, of course, is the great breakthrough, the recognition that none of them had been able to treat this as a first-person discussion. Even though there were no many lesbian people present at the it's always discussed about a they, but that this was the way forward. And I have to involve first-person discussion. And then, boom, 6 weeks later, suddenly out of the blue, we get Fiducia Supplicans. And I think that what's extraordinary about Fiducia Supplicans is, curiously, not it as a document, but it as a fact. Because as a document, as you know and will have read, it says nothing new. And it bends over backwards to say it's saying nothing. In fact, it says there's nothing new so often that you begin to wonder who is fooling who. It holds to a very conservative position on the understanding of marriage. It says not one of all that at all. It then talks about blessings, and it opens up blessings to be, if you like, how would one say it, a proxy discussion for the abundance of grace, which I think is a very good was a very, very fine way of resolving the problem. But then it specifically talks about being able to bless people. It specifically talks about blessing. Now, you have seen the reactions, as I have, from all over the place. What is the huge difference? What is it? What is the fact that has happened? The fact that has happened is that for a first time, instead of the sacred allegy dominating the Roman position, the Roman position is to face down the sacred allegy, which is extraordinary. For anybody who has lived in the sort of violence that this issue produces within the ecclesiastical structure, the one thing I did not expect, at least as soon as this, was the Roman position being, we will face down the sacred allegy. In other words, the sacred allegy will now emerge in full force, as it has, but it will be the bad reaction to our document, not the good reaction to our document. You see the very subtle difference, because the moment it says you can bless these people, effectively it's saying to literally the whole of the ecclesiastical world, learn to bless on the outside what you are fighting against on the inside. It's a shock to the mirror. It's a shock to the mirror of the clerical system. There's no question about that at all. And it's saying the sacred allegy, let's get that out, because it's only when that's out and people have become aware how ridiculous it is that actually reasoned discussion will be able to take place. You can't have reasoned discussion while you're in the throes of the sacred allegy. And the sacred allegy depends on people not being able to talk about it. Sacred allegy is always a cover-up. So I think it's an extraordinarily brave document for him to have lanced the ball, if you like, the sacred allegy, which runs the issue, by saying, okay, you're going to have your reactions, we can expect the reactions, but those are no longer the reactions of the church. They're reactions against the teaching of the church. We're going to give you a long time to react to it culturally. And I was very pleased with the Holy Father's remarks after we got a frankly parodic declarations from Cardinal Lambongo about the matter. The Holy Father says, yes, in Africa, for reasons of culture, although there are homosexual people there, as everywhere, for reasons of culture, it is not possible for them to recognize all this. Okay? Wonderful. This issue has been transformed from an issue of divine revelation to an issue of culture. Genius step, and absolutely necessary. Because, of course, for the reasons which I gave at the beginning, every culture is going to have its own way through this, discovering what the forms of relationships are as family structures change. Why do family structures change? Well, because of advanced capitalism. Let's not be Africa. It's not that there is a wave, if you like, of simply of either pro-gay or anti-gay evangelists turning up in Africa, though actually there is a huge wave of anti-gay evangelists with big American money behind them, as we know. But the fact is, what's really causing change is the changes in family structure produced by capitalism, movements from country to city, all the same factors that eventually produced the world which we know. But of course, they are going through in 30, 40 years what we went through in 400. So, pacienza. But that doesn't stop there being real issue and real suffering involved with that at the time. So, I mean, I thought that was a brilliant point on his part, facing down the issue of the reaction by saying culture, not divine teaching, the possibility of blessing, and of course, we all know what church structures are like, particularly in places where people claim there is no homosexuality, there's nothing here. What does that mean? There's a lot of homosexuality that everyone is too frightened to talk about. that I should say is in my own experience, my own visits to African countries. So it's not significant. The cultural living is very different, but the fact is not the question of how this is going to be lived, and more importantly, how is it going to be able to be taught? Well, what it will inevitably mean is that the bishops can shout out loud to everyone in the world that in Africa this doesn't exist and that it's not going to happen, and they forbid people to be blessed. But Rome did not leave the giving of permission to priests to bless in the hands of the bishop. Young priests in Africa will find themselves being able to be naughty, and strangely, they will be being naughty with the blessing of Rome. This is the this is the thing they're going to be able to be created. So I think that actually there's an enormous amount to be said going forward here. Okay, how are we doing for time?
Say
5 minutes. Okay, I'll try and
to engage a conversation.
Yeah, of course it is. What I had wanted to get to long before now, and I'm sorry to take so long to get, is the question of witness. Because it seems to me that Fergus Carr, who I mentioned to you at the beginning, was right. There is no mechanism for dealing with this, because it is a massive cultural change. It is something where something that is true about people is asserting itself slowly and with difficulty through different cultures and in different ways. But that means that ultimately, as a church, the ability of Peter to recognize, saying these are just like us, is going to be a matter of witness and recognizing witness. Well, what does witness begin to look like? I've seen many heroic witnesses in different countries and different parts of the world. People have stood up under really quite extraordinary circumstances of pressure to be able to be who they are. In some cases, have had to go into exile, so on and so forth. We are finding the global network of Rainbow Catholics, which is a group of which I'm a member, which tends to hold together different membership from different parts of the world, are the leaders in 3 of our African countries have had to go into exile. Not because of Fiducia Supplicans, but just because of legal changes in Uganda and Kenya and Malawi over the last year. It's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. The vengeance with which this started to be pursued. So, what does it look like? Well, I think the first thing, and this is what is important to me as a preacher, is allowing people good conscience. Allowing people to discover that their ability to tell the story about themselves is a true story. And where this starts, curiously enough, is the recognition of what I've just told you. That up till now, strangely enough, the church's teaching in this area has been an a prioristic deduction from something that actually has nothing to do with who we are. It was never based on a study of who we are and said, oh, because you're this sort of person, therefore you mustn't do this sort of thing. No, it was an a prioristic deduction from a structure of acts, saying, you must treat yourself as though you are a defective version of that. But, and this is the important thing, at the level of teaching, that is supposed to be a deliverance of natural law. The whole point of natural law teaching is that it's a teaching which supposedly is the kind of ordinary rational understanding that any human could reach by the light of reason. But at this stage, the natural law is showing us something entirely different, which is that there just are people who are this way, and what I refer to as a non-pathological minority variant within the human condition. And therefore, according to the church's own teaching concerning nature and grace, that who we are to be is going to flow from who we are, not in spite of who we are. There will no doubt be lots of learnings of full squeeze on the way, but none of us have any reason at this stage to think that a sexual orientation is a false we. It's just something that is of rather similar quality as left-handedness or iris color, those being other non-pathological minority variants in the human condition. And normally, for instance, with left-handedness now, that used to be regarded, as you know, as a sort of defect in universal right-handedness, now we would assume that it's not the fact of being left-handed, but what you do with your left hand is the important thing. And I think that that is obviously going to be the case. The question now is going to be, okay, what is the form of flourishing appropriate for this sort of human, about whom the church has literally never had anything to say before? We realize that it's not that there is a wrong teaching, there is a total vacuum of teaching. From the moment you realize that the only teaching that there has been is an a prioristic deduction of something you are not, then the question arises of, okay, I can stand loose from that. I don't need to fight with that. Anybody who says to me, you aren't really who you think you are, I know better than you, is gaslighting. That's not teaching. That's trying to force you to take part in a sacred bubble in which you don't belong, and one which will have bad consequences for you psychologically. So the question is, what is the appropriate sort of flourishing? And I think that part of our witness is going to be your generation discovering this and manifesting what are the appropriate sorts of flourishing in such a way that it becomes evident that we are capable of giving ourselves away in love to others. Because that seems to me to be what the evidence of the life of the Spirit is in a person. That's what I would hope that Peter would be looking at when Peter is able to say, are these people like us? Now, the difficulty with all that is because that involves us being able to speak in the first person with people who are able to speak respectfully in the third person. In other words, such that the dialogue is not impossible, simply because we say, we are this way, and they say, no, you're not. If you want to belong to God, you must decree yourself to be something other and go and get cured, or whatever. And I think the key question is, how is it going to become possible to say you? And curiously, second person discourse is the most difficult in this area. Because being able to say you can so easily be an accusation. You bastards who are always screwing us up. Or you wicked people who are doing this. And I think it's one of the things that, for me at least, is the work, the spiritual work of the church, is being in a position where we can say thou to someone in such a way that we're actually saying yes to the whole of them. Not yes, but you can fit in, yes, but do pretend a little if you want to get through. As you know, is the seminary instruction. Recently, a former English college student was telling me about the submarine, for the submarine of many seminarians. He said, become a submarine, go underwater, no waves, be invisible, only come to the surface once ordained, and the bishop has to deal with you as you are. The trouble about that is that if you have done that through your process of formation, you have actually agreed to be a closed down instrument that will not be capable of growing up and sharing grace. You think that it's a temporary thing. It will in fact form you. So this is, how do we reach a place where the voice of Christ, which those of us who are gay and lesbian and who have been able to work through this process of conscience, recognizing that we are not being spoken to by the so-called magisterium, which isn't a magisterium because it doesn't reflect the voice of the magister. The voice of the magister says, thou. And the voice of the magister fed through many other people saying thou. How do we reach the place where we can say thou? And where we can, as we can say thou to the teaching authority of the church as something that is actually part of us and something that we are helping and rejoicing. Anyhow, I'm sorry not to have got onto that part earlier, but as you can see, I had quite a long way to get through. So,
thank you, James. You could become a novice master, I guess. Thank you for this genealogy of gender identities and sexual orientation, the continent of sexuality and gender that you have been exploring for decades, and theologically using also the lens of mimetic theory to engage a theological reflection from the forgiven victim and the intelligence of the victim. So the floor is open for comments, questions, the audience here. If people in Facebook also want to make some comments, please go ahead. There is a Matthew Bale. Thank you.
That's good. Can you hear me?
So.
Okay. Thank you for this talk. It seems to me that what you've articulated in relation to the church's teaching on sex and everything, sex and gender, everything you're talking about. The psychology or the sociality behind it and identifying it seems to me this has way wider implications, not just for a particular loci of church teaching, but for our whole understanding of authority. Just in the sense that there's a certain construal of the Catholic understanding of authority that goes like this. We've never been wrong on anything. We've never changed our mind. And please God, let it never emerge that. And if something is on the books, there's a sort of full elaborate system of false consciousness that emerges in order to scurry around to make what is on the books and is patently attained in position appear to be part of a continuous development or whatever. So I would love to just hear your reflections on that wider problem of sort of false consciousness that at least one construal of our meta-doctrine about the nature of the church authority generates by its very nature. One thing that, not that I'm an expert on the theological and canonical issues surrounding this question, but something that sticks out to me, the sister of a close friend went through a divorce a few years ago, and he shared with me the process. They consulted with a canon lawyer. They had been married for 5 years or something. They consulted with a canon lawyer. The canon lawyer said, "This is great. You know, we've got everything we need, the evidence to do the annulment. We can show that you were never married." And at that moment, it struck her like, "But I know I was married." And so the way she put it to him was, the church which I love is asking me not to know what I know. And the conditions for being a part of that communion was to commit to never knowing what I know, which is that we were married and it fell apart and like blew up our lives. But that could be the case even with more sort of pointy-headed issues in all the rest of the theological conflict we deal with. So that's the kind of sort of false consciousness that it seems to me pervades a lot more than just this issue. So I would love to just hear your wider reflections on it.
Would you like to go for a set of questions or each? Shall I try to answer? Yeah. I mean, first of all, you are obviously absolutely right. And I think that it's the real shock of the change from Platonic and Cartesian way of thinking, which has allowed the notion of a clear intellect to dominate unruly passions, which has been perfectly capable of dealing with unruly passions, provided they don't challenge the clear intellect. And that has proven to be a form of governance which seems to work basically until modern subjectivity became too strong for it. And it is now manifestly appears hypocritical whenever it turns up, because it's no longer how we understand reality. In the degree to which church authority is being caught up in trying to defend itself within that structure, it loses, in fact, loses all of it. Which is why I think that Pope Francis's insistence on the relational nature of learning, the horizontality of the process, is part of, quite properly, a way of learning in which the subjective and the apparent norm start to be able to be reimagined in such a way as to be variable. And I think that the key point in which he achieved that was the famous section of Amoris Laetitia, which insisted that the conscience is never, the magisterium is never above the conscience. It's always alongside. Now, and of course that was jumped at. The usual suspects, our dubia enamored friends, leapt on that because they could see immediately that affected not only the issue of forced remarriage, but also gave people the touches them more closer to the bone, because they could see that literally everything then becomes a question of what we can learn through each other, conversation, dialogue, horizontal time. Now, of course, there are other, in the initial framework, set it up as being a case of individual cases being able to work with this, but you don't need to be a genius to know that individual cases very quickly discover sociological solidarity in something that becomes true of a class of people, not merely of the people who are in a particular dialogical situation. In other words, obviously, this is going to require a whole new way of discerning the realities described. And yes, I think that you're absolutely right. Famously, apparently, they said that this was what 5 4 6 was, that if you were to let go the link between the property and the community, it would put a bullet hole in the church's authority. In fact, of course, his refusal to do that put a much greater bullet hole in the church's authority, because authority is only ever wielded by those who have learned. The refusal to learn is never a place from which to teach. If you are refusing to learn, then you don't have a teacher. You have instead of teaching, because it's too difficult for me to cope with this. And I'm afraid that's what has happened. The church has been stuck for 50 years with a refusal to teach because we aren't able to teach with this. So we're going to stick with that mission. And I think that has helped with the loss of real authority. And I think that this is, for me, this is the Petrine model. Whom did Jesus appoint? Jesus appointed the guy who got it wrong the whole time. The ineffectibility of the church is in the Petrine learning process. The guy who baptized Gentiles was the guy who discovered that he'd been wrong about purity, about shame, about Jesus, who he had betrayed, and about how linked those were. I think that the indefectibility is to do with, as I said, the joy of being wrong. It's when you're able to, the kind of rightness to which we may attain is only the kind of rightness discovered through being wrong. We are that sort of being, humans are that sort. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. There's a whole anthropology of learning that is vital to the recovery of church authority.
Thank you, James. There's another question here by Martin, the STM. And if there are some other questions, please raise your hand and then.
Thank you, James. So, first question is, in the genealogy and sort of history that you explained for the past 50, 80 years, you also described, and especially within the last 20 years, you know, I'm Chilean and there's a group of Chilean theologians here, and we have the situation that's horrible. So it's almost impossible to be Catholic without having at least being part of this conversation. So the first question is, what do you think the sexual abuse crisis becoming public in the world? What do you think the role of that is? The second question is, you described somehow a cultural perspective or a cultural epistemology for understanding the issue. And you also spoke of decoloniality at the beginning, and a sort of understanding in between locality and universality within the church, self-understanding. So the question there is, do you think that the fact that this is the first South American Pope, and the fact that there is another culture that is not the European culture rising in power in the Catholic Church has anything to do with this process? And the third question would be, there is an article, and Andrew Prewitt and Lloyd spoke about anti-blackness from some Theology that talks about the privilege of defining humanity by the Church. Don't you think that this is still a form maintaining that privilege, within that we have the privilege of defining humanity? With at the source of the situation, and it was also at the source of slavery, political theology, right? And then just two comments. The first one is how much life this has stolen from all of us, from families, friends, history, how much possibilities. And then, do you think that the Latin American history with the church, the racial theology, and the formation of the so-called two churches in South America has also allowed somehow to be going through this process of upgrade?
Thank you, Martin. Please, James.
Because there were so many questions, I've forgotten the first one. Can you repeat
This crisis.
the second is But the sexual abuse crisis, again, I try to think of this historically. In my country, the sexual abuse crisis started to become visible in the 1980s, owing to a helpline set up by a television anchor. People started calling in. And I think that it's to do with, again, the growth of children's subjectivity being something that was capable of first-person expression, which is, of course, relatively recent in our culture. So, in the case of my country, again, the first major scandals were the state orphanages. And of course, this started to happen at the same time as people became aware of homosexuality and it being legalized. At a time when, even though it may have been legalized, it still was not popularly accepted, which took rather longer. At least was in the case of my country. I think that in many other countries, the Catholic Church was effectively the messenger as well as the message, because people's awareness of child abuse as a thing came out because of church-related abuse scandals. And that means, of course, that the attempt to do something about it was immediately entrapped, as it was in this country, within intra-ecclesial rows, particularly, the determination by the John Paul Guard that it be associated with homosexuality, so that it could be blamed on homosexuals, which of course they were themselves, while they tried to get rid of these dangerous people. So the whole argument became completely distorted for a long time within church circles. It really took a good deal of lay pressure from lay people and the more rational studies to begin to suggest these two were not the same issue. And that's been a problem I think in every country where it's been started. First assumption is that there is some inherent link between homosexuality and everybody has had to go through that and work out that that's not true. Not just because someone says so, but because they discover for themselves that it's not actually true. So I think that in many cases, part of the result, and I'm just thinking now in terms of France, which is obviously dealing with this particularly strongly at the moment, part of the result of the shame produced by the complicity in the cover-up of child abuse has led to it becoming more possible to have a realistic discussion about the gay question, simply because bishops are no longer in a position to speak with any credibility on the subjects at all, until they've made it quite clear that they actually understand themselves that there is a link between the two. And of course, that is incredibly difficult when the majority of bishops is gay. It's just very difficult. It's very difficult to have rational conversation, which is why the German synodal path has been so interesting in making it possible for these conversations to happen by sitting at separate tables, so that without shame, the bishops, they can finally settle into a place where they can have rational conversation with others. And that's required very considerable communication or organizational skill. And I think that that's something which we are all going to face. How not to shame people into a position where they can talk with relative honesty and freedom. Remembering that that then shocks other people who think that all this ought to be shut up. Anyhow. As regards Latin America, and my experience of it, I remember spending time with a young former member, a gay former member of Pinochet's intelligence service, who described watching at night the house of Monsignor Precht, who was at that time the Vicar of Solidarity. And they were convinced that he was having links with communists and that there was information being set out between Solidarity and communists. And their evidence for this was young men leaving Monsignor Precht's house at 3 in the morning. And my friend, being gay, could immediately tell that this had nothing whatever to do with anything political, but was assignations of a quite different sort. And in other words, that the Chilean church reality was the same as everywhere else, whether on the left or the right. Now, one of the things that happened, from my own perspective, during the period from the 80s into the 90s, was that initially the liberation side of things in South America was very homophobic. The link was with Fidel Castro. The notion, I remember when Fidel Castro at a certain stage put gay people in work camps with work will make you men. El trabajo os hará hombres, literally, in imitation of Auschwitz over the door. Why? Well, again, for purely deductive reasons. If you were being revolutionary, meant being natural and good, and gayness was a feature of bourgeois aristocratic decadence. And all those had left at the time of the revolution and gone to Miami. So there were no gay people left. But therefore, if any people were born and turned out to be gay, they must secretly be counter-revolutionaries. It's a fantastic piece of communist logic. As it were, queers under the bed. But the link between being a counter-revolutionary and being gay was part of the official rhetoric. Therefore, you send people to camps. And believe it or not, it wasn't until a visit from the youth movement of the Czech Communist Party in the late 60s. The Czech Communist Party was the most hardline homophobic European Communist Party. The youth group educated them about how this wasn't necessary. But anyhow, my own experience was that the liberating, the so-called liberating, were very, because of the notion of the purity of the proletariat and the working class. The existence, for instance, of the omnipresence of transvestites in all Black Brazilian society was completely right. It was absolutely, literally amazing, the inability to see expressions of popular or culture. But anyhow, that was that. And curiously, it was at the early stage, it was the more conservative people who were playing the old game, don't ask, don't tell game. You know, let's not talk too loudly about this. Let's do that. Now that changed during the John Paul period dramatically, with people when being publicly homophobic was one of the requirements for becoming a bishop, and the how do you say this? And the left wing started after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the notion that the poor were a pure lump, to become aware of diversity, of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, which before was very disapproved of. Before the fall of the Berlin Wall, if you suggested that maybe these were real issues, no, that was a sign of enajenación from the true good. So I think that I don't know what Bergoglio's personal process of learning in that was, but it was a strange journey, which is where what was left and what was right are not obvious. If that makes it. I'm sorry.
Thank you, James. There is probably for one or two more questions. Professor Jeremy Wilkins, probably somebody. Yeah, this is Jason.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll try to speak up. Thank you very much. It's a very illuminating discussion. And I was thinking about an interesting connection to this morning's conversation, because it seems like one of the things that actually is at stake in the background here is like what the meaning of being reasonable really is concretely, right? Like there's a strange feature of these cultural discussions, especially in this country, like this is what reason and nature requires, and that's why it needs the sanction of law, or that's why it has to be buttressed by church authority or whatever. And so there's a kind of performative contradiction in like the claim that like there's some abstract reason that requires thus and so, and that's what nature delivers to us, but that's not the outcome we're going to get unless we enforce that outcome. And so that seems odd to me versus the other thing, which I think is right, which is that what reason really is about is like this effort of being reasonable and like trying to have a conversation where you're actually committed to learning. The problem is that takes a lot of practice in a certain sense. And, you know, precisely because I think the formational structures of the church are so kind of enervated right now. It's a beautiful vision of what the church could be, what the sensus fidelium could mean, right? Reasoning together in love and so forth. But like, it seems like we're so far from being able to realize that in ourselves, and to be of service to our people, like help the conditions for that sort of thing really to emerge.
Please, Professor Jason. In that way, we can listen to the two of them and the final. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah. Probably, yeah. Well, we can listen briefly, the two of you, please.
I'll go quickly, then. Thank you very much for your lecture this afternoon. I'd like to invite a further comment. You were consistently insisting that there's a vacuum of the churches in the vacuum. There's a vacuum in the churches on homosexuality because it's always been about act rather than about being. And then toward the end, I had a sense that perhaps the problem is not the tendency to make a prioristic deductions from act to being, but rather that the evaluation of which acts are morally good has been lacking, or perhaps not as important as national thought could be. Could you comment on this, please, in light of issues about gender? Transgender, because you made the comment that if you tell me who you are and I didn't know who you are this and gaslighting you. On the transgender question, it seems to me that the Holy Father is still gaslighting you. And that perhaps the question about act and being, at least on that question, we haven't made a step forward yet. I hope that this has been
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, on the issue of gaslighting, of course, there are real sources of expertise on real issues where we genuinely don't know things about who we are. If I go and see a doctor because I've got a pain in my stomach, I say, I think this is diverticulitis, and he says, no, it's gastroenteritis. I don't say, you're gaslighting me, I know. It's because I've gone to someone who genuinely does know about who I am. So, I mean, the notion that there are people who can help us learn more about who we are, and that this is something, especially, we would expect scientific rigor and learning for us to be able to trust their authority, particularly in delicate issues, particularly in hyper-delicate issues of the sort that you're describing with gender identity. Yes, so I think the issue in the area, at least of the gay part of that, is that the jury is at this stage out on the issue of what the expertise is. There is no pathology intrinsic to this. Therefore, ordinary Catholic understanding would be agere sequitur esse. Acting follows from being. That is the normal. I don't necessarily think that it's a question of only the shift from acts to identity. I think it's the deduction of the acts from a form of act that is not being intended. If you say to people, okay, and the church is trying to do this, okay, we'll dump the stuff about you being objectionably disordered because we recognize that's nonsense, but the acts are still intrinsically evil. Well, you say, why are the acts intrinsically evil? Well, because they lack the indispensable finality of being able to have a baby. And then you say, well, why the fuck should I be thinking that I should be trying to have a baby? Is there something in me that inherently is actually wanting to have a baby and I'm just getting it wrong? Because that's what you're effectively saying. Or is what I'm doing a perfectly sensible way of sharing love and friendship with a partner of the same sex, which has its own reason of being. There is a way in which this sort of relationship gives glory to God. So it's a question of what's the teleology? But please don't force me to be judged with the teleology of something that I'm not. So that's that. As to the Holy Father, again, I'm ready what they're going to come up with. They say they're going to come up on gender identity. The first one, the one which Catholic education was so bad, but one hopes that they've gone back and what I think. From his remarks, which does initially always sound a bit like this, his concern is always, and this seems a proper concern, I think it's something to borrow from that, is people putting themselves in the place of the Creator, saying, I am carte blanche, I can start from who I am, and I can choose to be a Madonna, or I can choose to be the Holy Power. Okay, now this is nonsense. Now, I don't know of any trans people of whom that was ever part of their approach to it. On the contrary, I've met people who've taken more seriously the issues of who they have discovered themselves to be, what the process of discovering themselves as a created human has looked like, and what part they are called actively to play in discovering who they are. If ever you took that seriously, without in any way denying the Creator. It's such. So I can see in principle the point of making it quite clear that whatever this discussion is, it mustn't be some sort of claim of a carte blanche. It would merely be, as it were, mimetism unanchored from any basis in biology and culture. But the whole question of finding non-gaslighters who are prepared to help people discover who they really are through the issues of biology, that's something which I think is part of what we hope scientific expertise is developing as we talk. Is that fair?
And finally, the last brief question, please, Nick.
Boa tarde, Carlos.
No, wait a little bit, please, Joel.
Me escuta, Carlos?
Yeah. He's ready. It's for the next panel. Sorry, it's from Brazil.
Great.
Yeah. Well,
No. Sorry.
João, ainda estamos na fala anterior.
Espeta um pouco.
nenhum problema.
Genealogy concerns, like what has happened to us as like historical circumstance, apologizing, where the only agency queer folk have genealogy seems to be that we hook up quiet. What is the role? My question is agency for lay Catholics, queer, trans, women, subalterns, specifically.
The question of agency for lay Catholics, I think, is secondary to the agency of human. Because I think the whole point of the church is for humanity rather than. Public is such that they're able to be looked upon and treated as worthy. And I think that you actually have increasing number of examples of politicians, sports persons, artists, actors, etc., who are being able to become role models in this sense. And very often they teach us far more than any enthusiastic person about life and dignity and those things. I think also particularly something that I've noticed, which is how frequently, precisely because it's a world with so much, the possibilities of the closet and ignorance and dishonesty are so great, that actually the honesty of people who've been through that and are able to appear in public is particularly appreciated. I think that purity is one of the forms of public agency we've been able to see. I think newscasters, some politicians who just come out and leave it out, they're actually more respect for that, given that it's clear that they must have gone through shit in order to have reached the stage of being to do that. So I think that kind of agency, thank heavens, is becoming increasingly visible and possible. Of course, the church structures should run away from it and takes that for granted. Eventually, they will have to start reckoning with it. But that's where we are at the moment. The difficulty for them of dealing with people who can talk honestly and straightforwardly about things which they themselves cannot. And I think that's like the witness and the agency that I see and has been since people started being able to say, oh, there's something wrong in this being persecuted business. Love that does not speak it says that speak its name. Is that better?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, James, for all the insight you have been sharing with us. And the conversation will continue. Thank you.